Picture this. You're standing on your family ranch, facing armed police officers sent by your HOA to seize your property, when suddenly Clint Eastwood steps beside you, ready to defend your freedom. Would you surrender your independence to power-hungry bureaucrats who profit from keeping Americans dependent on their systems? This isn't just another HOA nightmare. It's a modern-day showdown between a hard-working American's right to self-sufficiency and those trying to control how free men live. Growing up in rural Montana, I always dreamed of owning a piece of land to call my own. My father taught me the value of self-reliance, how a man should be able to provide for himself without depending on others. Land is freedom, he'd say, and freedom is what makes us American. After 35 years working as a construction foreman, saving every extra dollar I could, I finally had enough to buy my dream. 15 acres with a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Eagle Creek. The rolling hills, the open sky, the sense of possibility, it was everything I'd worked for. The previous owner mentioned something about a homeowners association that hadn't been active in years. Just a formality, he said. The annual fee was minimal, and nobody had enforced the covenants in over a decade. Seemed harmless enough. For the first 2 years, life was perfect. I raised a few horses, grew my own vegetables, and spent evenings on my porch watching the sunset. My neighbor, Jim Peterson, became a good friend. He'd retired from the film industry years ago, but still kept in touch with his Hollywood connections. We'd often share a beer and talk about the old days, him in movies, me building America one construction site at a time. Then everything changed when a new board took control of our dormant HOA. They called a mandatory meeting at the community center, where a slick-looking man in an expensive suit introduced himself as Richard Thornton, the new HOA president. Eagle Creek is entering a new era, he announced, unveiling plans to modernize our rural community. What this meant became clear quickly. Strict new regulations requiring all homes to connect to municipal utilities, prohibitions against unsightly agricultural activities, and hefty new monthly dues to fund their vision of progress. As I left that meeting, Jim caught my eye across the room and shook his head. We both knew what was coming, trouble for anyone who valued independence over conformity. The trouble started 3 weeks later. I just finished installing solar panels on my barn roof, 20 high-efficiency units that would take me completely off the electrical grid. With Montana's long summer days, I'd have enough stored power to get through the winters too. I'd also dug a new well on the eastern corner of my property, where the water table was high and pure. I was surveying my work with pride when a white SUV pulled into my driveway. A woman in a pantsuit emerged, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Harmon? I'm Sandra Wilkins, compliance officer for the Eagle Creek HOA. I'm here about an unauthorized structural modification." I showed her my county permits for the solar installation and explained that Montana state law protected homeowners' rights to renewable energy systems. She smiled thinly. "I'm afraid our updated HOA covenants require board approval for all exterior modifications. Additionally, Section 14.3 now requires all properties to connect to municipal power and water systems." A week later, the first violation notice arrived. $500 fine for unauthorized solar installation. The following week, $750 for non-compliant water systems. Then $1,000 for my vegetable garden being excessive in size and visibility. When I called to protest, I was transferred directly to Richard Thornton. "Mr. Harmon," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "these regulations ensure consistency and property values. Your frontier lifestyle choices are simply out of step with our community standards. These rules weren't in the covenants when I bought this place," I argued. "The board voted to update the covenants last month. Perhaps you should attend meetings more regularly," he replied. "Besides, connecting to northern Montana Utilities' electrical grid and municipal water system is safer and more reliable. We're only looking out for community welfare." Later that week, I ran into Jim at the local hardware store. When I mentioned my troubles, his expression darkened. "Thornton's brother-in-law is Philip Morgan," he said, "CEO of Northern Montana Utilities. They control all electrical service, water distribution, and natural gas in 3 counties. Every house they force to connect to their systems is thousands in connection fees and then monthly bills forever, pure profit for them. This isn't just happening to you, Frank. The conflict escalated over the next 3 months. I ignored their fines and continued expanding my self-sufficient systems, adding rainwater collection and a geothermal heating setup. They responded by increasing the penalties and sending inspectors who trespassed on my property, taking photos and claiming my systems were hazardous. At a town meeting, I discovered I wasn't alone. Sarah Jenkins, a 72-year-old widow living on her pension in the house she'd owned for 40 years, broke down in tears describing how the new water connection fees would force her to sell the home where she'd raised her children and cared for her late husband. Her son, Michael Jenkins, a respected investigative journalist with the Billings Gazette, sat beside her, his face grim as he took detailed notes. Marcus Delaney, a Vietnam veteran with a distinguished Purple Heart and a fierce independent streak, was facing similar harassment over his solar panels and wind turbine. I didn't fight for this country to have some paper pusher tell me I can't harvest the sun and wind on my own property, he declared, to murmurs of approval. We formed a homeowners' rights group and filed complaints with the county commissioners. 26 of us signed a petition challenging the HOA's authority to force these connections. Thornton's response was swift and harsh. The HOA voted to place liens on properties with unpaid fines, starting with mine. $27,500 in violations, plus administrative fees. They initiated foreclosure proceedings, giving me 30 days to pay or lose my ranch. This is still America, I told Jim over the phone that night. There's got to be a way to fight this. Actually, Jim said thoughtfully, I might know someone who could help. An old friend who understands a thing or two about standing your ground. The foreclosure notice hit me hard. 3 decades of construction work, calloused hands, aching back, winters in freezing conditions, summers in blistering heat, all to lose my piece of America to some paper-pushing bureaucrats who'd never built anything real in their lives. I consulted a lawyer in town who specialized in property disputes. Her news wasn't encouraging. They've been clever about this, she explained. That dormant HOA you mentioned? They legally reactivated it and followed the technical procedures for amending the covenants. The conflict with state law on renewable energy might give us an angle, but litigation could take years and cost more than the fines themselves. When I asked about the connection between Thornton and Northern Montana Utilities, she sighed. Conflicts of interest in HOAs aren't explicitly illegal unless there's proof of kickbacks or bribes. The relationship alone isn't enough. I felt trapped. Fighting would cost everything I had. Paying would mean surrendering the independence I'd worked my whole life to achieve. Selling wasn't an option. This land was my retirement plan, my legacy, my home. The pressure tactics intensified. Thornton arranged for utility workers to mark my property for mandatory connections. HOA representatives left notices on my door almost daily. 2 board members even approached my horses in the pasture, claiming they needed to inspect the animals for welfare concerns. That crossed a line. Nobody messes with a man's horses. I installed security cameras around my property and posted no trespassing signs. When Sandra Wilkins returned for another inspection, I met her at the property line. This is private property. You're not welcome here without permission. She smirked, holding up a document. This authorization from the HOA board gives me legal right to inspect for covenant violations. That paper isn't worth the ink it took to print it, I replied. This is still America, and in America, a man's home is his castle. As tensions escalated, so did the stakes. The HOA sent certified letters to my neighbors, warning them against supporting my dangerous noncompliance. They scheduled an emergency community meeting to discuss health and safety concerns at my ranch, a transparent attempt to turn my neighbors against me. Some caved to the pressure, avoiding me at the general store or the gas station. But others grew more supportive, recognizing that today it was my solar panels. Tomorrow it could be their garden or workshop or family gatherings. Sarah Jenkins brought me a homemade apple pie and whispered that her son, a journalist in Billings, was looking into Northern Montana Utilities business practices. Marcus and his veteran friends started taking shifts driving by my property, keeping an eye out for HOA trespassers. The 20-day mark of my 30-day notice arrived. Jim called, sounding unusually upbeat. "Remember that friend I mentioned? He's coming to town tomorrow. Said he'd like to meet you." "Jim, I appreciate it, but unless your friend is a miracle worker or a high-priced attorney willing to work for free, I don't see how he can help." "Trust me," Jim chuckled. "This guy has a way of changing the odds. Come over for dinner tomorrow at 6. And Frank, bring all your HOA paperwork. Every letter, every notice, every piece of evidence about Thornton and his brother-in-law." The next evening, I drove over to Jim's place with a box of documents and a heavy heart. 10 days left before they could legally take my ranch. 10 days before losing everything. I knocked on Jim's door, expecting to meet some retired lawyer or local politician. Instead, when the door opened, I found myself face to face with Clint Eastwood. "Frank," Jim said with a grin, "meet my old friend Clint." "Clint, this is the neighbor I was telling you about." For a moment, I just stood there, speechless. Then Clint extended his hand. "Jim tells me you've got some trouble with people who don't respect a man's right to live his own way on his own land," he said, his voice exactly like it sounded in the movies. "Why don't you come in and tell me about it?" Over dinner, I laid out the whole situation. Jim had grilled steaks, Montana beef, raised by another neighbor fighting similar battles with the HOA. Clint listened intently, his iconic brow furrowing deeper with each detail I shared about the solar setup, the well, and the manipulative language in the HOA covenants. "Been dealing with similar issues at my ranch in California for years," he explained, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly authority. "Different rules, same principle, people trying to control how free Americans live on their own land. I don't understand why they care so much about my solar panels or my well," I said, pushing my plate aside. "I'm not hurting anyone. I'm just living the way my father and grandfather did." Clint leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing the way they had in a dozen westerns when he'd spotted injustice. "It's not about the panels or the well, Frank. It's never been about that. It's about control. Some folks can't stand seeing others living freely when they've accepted chains themselves. And there's nothing more threatening to a man who's surrendered his independence than seeing his neighbor refuse to do the same." Jim nodded, refilling our glasses. "And in your case, there's plain old greed involved too. Every independent homestead is money Thornton's brother-in-law doesn't make. Every man who stands on his own 2 feet is a threat to their entire system." After dinner, Clint asked to see the documentation. He examined each paper methodically, his weathered hands handling each document with care, his expression growing sterner as he read through the escalating threats and demands. "This isn't just an HOA overreach," he said finally, placing the papers down with controlled anger. "This is a systematic effort to drive out self-sufficient homeowners. The selective enforcement, the targeting of specific residents, the family connection to the utility company, it's all here in black and white. This is the kind of corruption that eats away at the foundation of what makes America special." "But my lawyer said proving the conflict of interest would be difficult in court," I replied, feeling defeated. Clint's eyes flashed with that steely determination familiar to anyone who'd seen his films. "In court, maybe," he said. "But there's more than one way to fight injustice in this country. Sometimes you need to shine a light on it where everyone can see. And sometimes you need to make a stand that people can't ignore." We talked late into the night, developing a strategy worthy of any showdown. Jim, with his connections to local media, Clint, with his understanding of standing firm against intimidation and his considerable influence, and me, with my first-hand knowledge of the HOA's tactics and unwavering commitment to my way of life. By midnight, we had more than a plan. We had a mission to protect a cornerstone of American freedom. "I'd like to see your setup tomorrow," Clint said as I was leaving. "These solar systems have come a long way since I installed mine years ago." The next morning, Clint and Jim arrived at my ranch. I showed them around proudly, the solar array that powered my home and barn, the rainwater collection system, the geothermal heat pumps, the vegetable garden that provided most of my food. "This is what America used to be about," Clint said, examining my inverter system. Self-reliance. Building something with your own hands. Not depending on corporations or bureaucrats to survive. We were discussing the efficiency of my battery storage when 3 vehicles pulled into my driveway. Thornton's luxury SUV, another board member's car, and a police cruiser with 2 officers inside. "Looks like we have company," Jim muttered. Thornton and his associate stepped out first, followed cautiously by the police officers. They all froze momentarily when they recognized Clint Eastwood standing next to my solar inverter. Thornton recovered quickly, smoothing his tie as he approached. "Mr. Harmon, we have a court order authorizing us to inspect your property for code violations. These officers are here to ensure you comply." The 2 police officers looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing the Hollywood legend standing beside me. One of them, younger with a military haircut, kept glancing at Clint with barely concealed admiration. "Is there a problem here?" Clint asked, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had commanded respect in dozens of films. Thornton, attempting to maintain his authority, explained that my off-grid systems violated HOA regulations and potentially endangered the community. "I've been looking at these systems all morning," Clint said calmly. "What I see is American ingenuity and self-reliance, the very values this country was built on." Jim had quietly positioned himself to the side, phone in hand, recording everything. The confrontation in my driveway was surreal. Thornton and his HOA associate on one side, me, Jim, and Clint Eastwood on the other, with 2 increasingly uncomfortable police officers caught in the middle. "Officers," Thornton said sharply, "we have a valid administrative inspection warrant authorized by Judge Reynolds for assessment of municipal code violations. Please ensure Mr. Harmon cooperates." The older officer, Sergeant Mike Davis according to his nameplate, cleared his throat. "Mr. Harmon, I'm afraid we do need to allow them access according to this order." Clint stepped forward slightly. "Before we proceed, I'd like to understand something. What specific safety concerns justify this level of intrusion?" Thornton bristled. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood, this is a matter between the Homeowners Association and Mr. Harmon." "I'm just a concerned citizen," Clint replied, his gaze unwavering. "One who believes in property rights and due process." The younger officer, Deputy Wilson, shifted nervously. "Sir, we're just here to accompany the HOA representatives as they conduct their inspection as ordered by the court." Clint nodded slowly. "I understand you're doing your job, officer. But before we proceed, I'd like you all to know that I've spent the morning making some calls." He pulled out his phone and showed them an email that made Thornton's face turn pale. A message from the State Attorney General's office confirming they were launching an investigation into possible conflicts of interest and abuse of power within our HOA. "It seems the connection between Mr. Thornton's family and the utility company forcing everyone onto their services might represent a legal problem," Clint continued. "And I've learned that in this state, HOAs cannot restrict reasonable energy independence or sustainable practices." Sergeant Davis examined the email on Clint's phone, then looked at Thornton with new suspicion. "Is this true? Is your family connected to Northern Montana Utilities?" Thornton's associate, a nervous-looking man with thinning hair, took a step back as if trying to distance himself from the situation. "Philip Morgan is my wife's brother," Thornton admitted reluctantly. "But that has nothing to do with HOA policy decisions." "Really?" Jim interjected, still filming everything with his smartphone. "Because I have copies of board meeting minutes where you specifically advocated for mandatory utility connections without disclosing that relationship." Sergeant Davis folded the court order and put it in his pocket. "Mr. Thornton, this inspection will need to wait until these allegations are addressed. I can't in good conscience enforce an order that may be compromised by undisclosed conflicts of interest." Thornton's face flushed with anger. "This is obstruction. I'll report this to your superior." "Feel free," Sergeant Davis replied calmly. "I'm sure Chief Barnes will be interested to hear about the potential ethics violations. He's quite passionate about transparency in local governance." Deputy Wilson, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Actually, There's a state law passed last year protecting homeowners' rights to renewable energy installations. My brother installed solar last summer and had similar problems with his HOA until he cited Montana Code Section 70-17-807. Thornton pointed an accusing finger at me. Harmon has violated multiple covenants beyond just the energy systems. He's been running an agricultural operation in a residential zone. Agricultural operation? I laughed. Growing tomatoes and keeping 3 horses on 15 acres in rural Montana? That's not agriculture, that's just living. And I think the evening news might be interested in how an HOA is trying to force homeowners to abandon self-sufficiency to benefit a board member's family business. Jim added, still recording. Thornton's composure cracked completely. Turn that camera off. You have no right. First Amendment says otherwise. Clint interrupted. Freedom of the press. Another founding principle worth protecting. The confrontation ended with Thornton and his associate retreating to their vehicles, promising legal consequences. Sergeant Davis and Deputy Wilson apologized for the disturbance and left without conducting any inspection. As the dust from their departing vehicles settled, Clint placed a hand on my shoulder. Round 1 goes to the independence movement, he said with the hint of a smile. But they'll be back. Power and money don't surrender easily. Jim stopped his recording and grinned. Not when they're up against a couple of stubborn ranchers. And Dirty Harry himself. He immediately pulled out his phone again. I'm sending this footage to Michael Jenkins at the Gazette and to my contacts at KRTV in Great Falls. By tonight, this will be on every news channel in Montana. Jim was true to his word. He didn't waste a single moment. That afternoon, he meticulously edited the video to highlight the most damning moments of the confrontation, including Thornton's admission about his brother-in-law and the officer's concerns about the legality of the inspection warrant. He then systematically distributed it through his network of media contacts built during his years in the film industry. Before sunset, the footage had been sent to every news outlet in Montana. By sunrise, it had exploded across regional and then national media. The headline practically wrote itself, Clint Eastwood stands with Montana rancher against HOA power grab. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My phone rang constantly, first neighbors I'd known for years expressing solidarity, then complete strangers from across the state sharing their own HOA horror stories. A reporter from the Billings Gazette was parked at the end of my driveway by 7 a.m. A constitutional law professor from the University of Montana called offering pro bono consultation about property rights and HOA limitations. This isn't just your fight anymore, Frank, Jim told me over coffee that morning, showing me how the video had already racked up hundreds of thousands of views. You've become a symbol for everyone who's ever felt pushed around by people who think they can control how Americans live. Thornton scrambled to contain the damage, issuing a carefully worded statement claiming the HOA was merely concerned with community standards and safety. But his corporate doublespeak fell on deaf ears. The narrative had completely transformed overnight. People weren't asking why I had solar panels. They were demanding to know why the HOA president's brother-in-law stood to profit from forcing people to abandon self-sufficient systems. 3 days after the confrontation, Clint made good on another promise. He called the governor, not a close friend as in the movies, but someone he'd met at charity events who respected his advocacy for conservation and property rights. The call wasn't recorded, but the results were immediate. The governor's office announced they were reviewing the state's HOA regulations, with special attention to conflicts of interest and restrictions on renewable energy. The pressure didn't just continue to build. It transformed into an unstoppable wave of public outrage. Sarah Jenkins' son, an investigative journalist with a talent for following money trails, published a blistering exposé of northern Montana utilities' corrupt business practices. His reporting revealed a years-long pattern of strategic political donations to local officials who subsequently championed mandatory connection regulations. Meanwhile, Marcus, the Vietnam veteran who'd once fought for American freedom abroad, now organized his fellow veterans to defend it at home. They staged a powerful silent protest outside the HOA's emergency board meeting, standing at attention in military formation, many wearing their service medals while holding signs that read, "Freedom isn't free. Neither are forced connections, and we didn't fight for America abroad to lose liberty at home. A week after our driveway showdown, the county commissioners called an emergency session to review the Eagle Creek HOA charter. The meeting was moved to the high school gymnasium to accommodate the crowd. Hundreds of homeowners showed up, many with stories similar to mine. I testified about the escalating fines and threats. Jim presented documented evidence of the connection between Thornton and Northern Montana utilities. Other residents shared their experiences with selective enforcement and intimidation. When Thornton took the podium to defend the HOA's actions, the crowd's murmurs of disapproval were audible. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by defensive anger. These regulations are necessary for consistent community development, he insisted. Off-grid systems create inconsistencies in planning and potential hazards. What hazards specifically? Asked Commissioner Helena Rodriguez. Thornton fumbled for an answer. Fire risks from improper electrical installations, groundwater contamination from unregulated wells. Do you have documentation of any such incidents in our county? She pressed. He did not. The state attorney general's office sent a representative who announced a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. We've received numerous complaints suggesting a pattern of using HOA authority to create financial benefit for connected parties, she stated. If substantiated, this would represent a serious breach of fiduciary duty. The turning point came when Clint Eastwood himself addressed the commissioners by phone, his distinctive voice filling the gymnasium through the speaker system. I've spent decades advocating for conservation and responsible land use, he said. What I witnessed at Frank Harmon's ranch wasn't about community standards or safety. It was about suppressing independence for profit. In America, we have a long tradition of standing against that kind of overreach, whether it comes from government or private entities. When the commissioners voted to suspend the Eagle Creek HOA's foreclosure authority pending the Attorney General's investigation, the crowd erupted in applause. As I left the gymnasium that evening, people I barely knew clapped me on the shoulder or shook my hand. An elderly man with tears in his eyes thanked me for standing up for the old ways. Back at my ranch, sitting on the porch with Jim and watching the sunset reflect off my solar panels, I felt something I hadn't felt since the trouble began. Hope. You know what Clint told me before he headed back to California? Jim said. He said this fight is happening all over the country, people trying to live independently versus those who profit from dependency. He said we might have just turned the tide here in Montana. All because you happen to be friends with Clint Eastwood. I marveled. Jim laughed. No, Frank. All because you refused to back down when they came for your way of life. Clint just helped shine a spotlight on it. The Attorney General's investigation moved with unprecedented urgency, fueled by public outrage and political pressure. While a typical investigation of this nature might take months, the egregious nature of the corruption and the high-profile attention from Clint Eastwood's involvement fast-tracked the process. Within 4 weeks, lightning speed for a complex legal investigation, their team had unearthed a treasure trove of damning evidence against Thornton and his co-conspirators. What they discovered wasn't just administrative overreach, it was a calculated scheme to undermine American independence for personal profit. Email records obtained through legal subpoenas revealed explicit conversations between Thornton, other board members, and Northern Montana Utilities executives. Once we force compliance with the water power regulations, we project a 22% revenue increase, wrote Philip Morgan, Thornton's brother-in-law and CEO, in one particularly incriminating message. Target the self-sufficient properties first. They're the biggest threat to our business model. The findings painted a picture of corruption that shocked even the most cynical observers. Thornton had received over $45,000 in consulting fees from his brother-in-law's company, while simultaneously pushing policies that directly benefited them. The HOA had maintained a secret priority enforcement list, specifically targeting properties with self-sufficient systems while deliberately ignoring similar technical violations by properties owned by friends and family of board members. Most egregiously, they had digitally altered official meeting minutes to retroactively authorize changes to the covenants without the legally required homeowner votes. A clear case of fraud. The consequences were swift and uncompromising. The state attorney general didn't just file civil charges. He announced criminal proceedings against Thornton and 3 other board members for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, corruption, and conspiracy. In a press conference that made national headlines, he declared, "This case represents one of the most egregious abuses of private governance authority I've seen in my career. In Montana, we value independence and honest dealing. We will not tolerate those who use positions of trust to enrich themselves by stripping away their neighbors' fundamental freedoms." Northern Montana utilities faced an even more aggressive response. A comprehensive investigation by both state regulators and federal authorities for improper business practices, potential violations of anti-monopoly regulations, and suspected corruption of local officials. For me and my neighbors, vindication came immediately. The Montana Supreme Court took the extraordinary step of issuing an emergency injunction that invalidated all fines and liens imposed by the Eagle Creek HOA during Thornton's entire tenure. The foreclosure proceedings against my ranch and several other properties weren't just dismissed. They were dismissed with prejudice and a formal judicial rebuke of the HOA's unconscionable tactics. But the most far-reaching change came when the governor, sensing a powerful political moment, signed an executive order strengthening protections for homeowners pursuing energy independence. Within days, the Property Owners Resource Freedom Act was fast-tracked through the state legislature with overwhelming bipartisan support. The comprehensive legislation explicitly barred HOAs from prohibiting or unreasonably restricting renewable energy installations, water collection systems, or small-scale food production. It established some of the strongest protections for self-sufficient homesteading in the nation, becoming a model that other states soon began to emulate. Thornton didn't just resign from the HOA board. He fled Eagle Creek entirely the very day the Attorney General's findings were published, his reputation in tatters and his career destroyed. His vacant position was unanimously filled by my neighbor Marcus, the Vietnam veteran whose military discipline and unwavering integrity made him the perfect choice to rebuild what Thornton had corrupted. Marcus immediately disbanded the old board and called for a community-wide constitutional convention to draft a completely revised charter. The new governing document, crafted with direct input from every household in Eagle Creek, represented a revolutionary approach to community governance. It transformed the HOA from a restrictive enforcement entity into a genuine community support organization focused on shared resources, emergency preparedness, road maintenance, fire prevention, and strictly voluntary cooperation. Most importantly, it included a homeowner's Bill of Rights that permanently protected property owners' autonomy and self-sufficiency. While the intense media spotlight eventually shifted to other stories, the impact of our stand against corruption reverberated far beyond our small Montana community. Inspired by our success, homeowners across the state, and then across the nation, began systematically challenging restrictive HOA policies that limited self-sufficiency. A dozen Montana counties quickly revised their regulations to prevent HOAs from restricting renewable energy or water independence, and a national movement for property owner freedom was born, with our little ranch at its symbolic center. One crisp autumn morning about a month after everything settled, I was fixing a fence post when a familiar black SUV pulled up my driveway. Jim was driving with Clint Eastwood in the passenger seat. "Thought we'd check in on the revolution," Jim called out as they approached. Clint surveyed my property, noting the solar panels gleaming in the sunlight and the new greenhouse I'd built without fear of HOA repercussions. "Looks like independence is doing well in Montana," he observed. We walked the property line, discussing the changes that had swept through Eagle Creek. The mandatory utility connections had been abandoned. Sarah Jenkins had installed her own modest solar system with help from a state grant program for seniors. Several neighbors had started community gardening projects, sharing knowledge and harvest. "This is how communities are supposed to work," Clint said as we reached my back porch. "Built on cooperation, not coercion." That evening, we gathered for dinner at my ranch. Me, Jim, Clint, Marcus, Sarah, and several other neighbors who'd fought alongside us. As we shared food grown on our own land, there was a sense of having reclaimed something precious that had nearly been lost. "You know," Clint said as we watched the sunset paint the mountains, "throughout history, there's always been a battle between those who want independence and those who profit from dependency. It never ends, but it's always worth fighting." Marcus raised his glass. To freedom, not just the big kind in the history books, but the everyday freedom to live on your own terms. And to unexpected alliances, Sarah added, smiling at Clint. Sometimes help comes from where you least expect it. As our impromptu celebration continued into the evening, I stepped away for a moment to stand alone at the edge of my property. The stars were emerging above the mountains. My horses grazed peacefully in the pasture. And in the distance, the lights of Eagle Creek twinkled like a reflection of the night sky. All of it, the land, the animals, the renewable systems that sustained us, the community that had united against corruption, represented something profound about the American spirit. The right to independence wasn't just written in laws. It was etched into the character of people unwilling to surrender it. The months following our victory brought lasting changes to Eagle Creek and beyond. Thornton and his associates faced significant consequences, financial penalties, professional disgrace, and in his brother-in-law's case, the loss of lucrative municipal contracts as investigations revealed systemic corruption. Northern Montana Utilities, which had monopolized electric, water, and gas services across 3 counties, underwent a management overhaul after shareholders demanded accountability. Their new president publicly committed to supporting consumer choice and energy independence, a dramatic shift in policy prompted by public pressure and regulatory scrutiny. Our story inspired similar movements across the state. HOA reform became a bipartisan issue in Montana politics, with new legislation establishing clearer boundaries on HOA authority and strengthening transparency requirements. The Property Owners Resource Freedom Act became a model for other rural states facing similar conflicts between self-sufficiency and corporate interests. On a personal level, life returned to the peaceful rhythm I'd always sought. My solar panels captured the Montana sun without harassment. My well provided clean water without monthly bills. My horses grazed freely, and my garden expanded to share produce with neighbors in need. Sarah Jenkins didn't have to sell her family home and, with help from Marcus and other neighbors, even installed her own modest solar system. Michael Jenkins, her journalist son, won a regional press award for his coverage of our struggle. Marcus Delaney continued to lead the transformed Eagle Creek Community Association with the same integrity and discipline he'd shown in military service, focusing on bringing neighbors together rather than controlling them. The transformed HOA, now called the Eagle Creek Community Association, focused on bringing neighbors together rather than controlling them. Seasonal potlucks, skill-sharing workshops, and a mutual aid network for elderly residents replaced punitive inspections and arbitrary fines. Jim and I remained close friends, often reminiscing about the day Clint Eastwood helped change the course of our community. Clint himself called occasionally to check in, pleased to hear how our stand had rippled outward into broader change. The most profound transformation, however, was in community spirit. Where once there had been fear and isolation, there now existed solidarity and cooperation. People who had been strangers before the conflict became friends and allies. The threat of losing our independence had reminded us all how precious it was. As for my ranch, it stood as a symbol of successful resistance against corporate overreach and HOA abuse. Visitors occasionally drove by, hoping to see where the Eastwood standoff had happened. What they found instead was simply an American homestead, a place where freedom was practiced daily in the most fundamental ways. When the HOA sent police to take my ranch, they never expected to face Clint Eastwood standing shoulder to shoulder with a man defending his American birthright to independence. What started as my personal battle became a rallying cry for freedom-loving Americans everywhere. Remember this. When you stand firm against those who'd control how free men live, you'll discover you're never truly alone. My ranch stands today not just as my home, but as a monument to what happens when forgotten American values suddenly find their defenders.